In this video, I'll be talking about the most iconic poses of every Mr. Olympia champion in bodybuilding history. I've done two videos before on the best and worst poses of every Mr. Olympia, so I thought that making this one was a no-brainer. I'll try to focus on non-mandatory poses for this one, however, there may be some overlap with the best poses video. In my opinion, an iconic pose is one that perfectly captures a bodybuilder's unique attributes, embodies their physique, and becomes instantly recognizable when it comes to their image both on and off the stage, but in my opinion, that doesn't necessarily mean that their most iconic pose has to be their best. Starting things off, we have Larry Scott with his trademark single bicep pose. Larry was the very first Mr. Olympia champion back in 1965, and this pose became one of his defining shots. He would stand with one arm curled up in a tight flex, highlighting those legendary biceps that almost looked cartoonish when it came to peak and fullness. At the same time, he would tilt his lower body slightly, cleverly hiding the fact that his legs were never the biggest. What makes this pose so iconic in my opinion is how smart and strategic it was when it came to the execution. It perfectly showcased Larry's incredible arms and very dense upper body, while downplaying any weaker points. It also had this classic, very confident feel. He looked almost relaxed, like he knew nobody could rival those biceps. Even decades later, when people think of Larry Scott, this single bicep shot is usually the first image that comes to mind. It really did set the tone for how bodybuilders would use posing, not only to display muscle, but also to craft an illusion and play into their strengths. Next up is Sergio Leva with his legendary victory pose where he would raise both arms high overhead in a triumphant display. Sergio, known as the Myth, had one of the most dramatic X-frames of all time, as many of you know by now, and this pose captured it all in a single moment. With his long, full limbs stretching upward, a tiny waist pinched in tight, and those massive lats flaring out like wings, it almost looked unreal, like a Greek god or statue come to life. This pose is so iconic in my opinion because of how it highlighted every one of Sergio's strengths while hiding anything that might have been considered a weakness. You could not see any lack of detail or proportion because your eyes were just pulled straight upward into that insane shape. It was also a very powerful way for him to either kick off a routine or end it with authority, almost as if he knew he was declaring victory before the judges had even made up their mind. Till this day, nobody has ever hit the pose quite like Sergio, at least in my opinion, and it still stands as one of the most recognizable images in all of bodybuilding history. Moving on, we have Arnold Schwarzenegger and his trademark 3/4 rear double bicep pose. Now, Arnold had plenty of signature shots over the years, but this one easily stands out as the most iconic. It is literally his trademark, the silhouette that became the logo for the Arnold Classic, which is arguably the biggest bodybuilding show in the world today. This pose perfectly showcased everything that made Arnold such a force. His massive, sweeping lats that were thick and well developed all around, detailed back as well that gave him an unmatched width and presence in the upper half, and also those incredible arms that just exploded and had that crazy bicep peak and detail. At the same time, he also posed pretty artistically here with a nice turn in his stance that cleverly minimized his legs, which were never quite as dominant as his upper body. Even at his most controversial appearances, like in 1980, this pose still looked mythical and very iconic. What I love about it personally, though, is how timeless the pose feels. It was so powerful that decades later, Cedric McMillan actually asked Arnold to hit this exact pose with him on stage at the Arnold Classic Awards just to recreate that legendary moment. It is an image that basically defined Arnold as a bodybuilder and helped inspire generations to lift and compete. Also, if you guys are enjoying the video so far, a like and sub would really be awesome, as it helps out the channel tremendously. Next up is Franco Columbo with his signature most muscular pose. Even though this was technically not a mandatory pose back when he was competing, it became such a part of his identity that there's actually an award named after him today, the Franco Columbo Most Muscular Award at the Arnold Classic. In my opinion, this pose was so iconic because of the sheer density and that crazy freak factor that Franco kind of, brought to the stage. He was not the most perfectly proportioned bodybuilder ever, pretty far from it, but his structure was not really too bad. It was a bit blocky and his legs were sometimes lagging, but when he went into that most muscular, none of that really mattered. His chest, traps, and arms really exploded with thickness and a lot of detail too, looking absolutely wild for that time. Altogether, this shot captured Franco's physique in a very raw way. He was never about delicate lines or that classical flow, even though he did compete in the golden era. He was more so about that brute muscle and sheer strength. And honestly, for the time, it looked almost unreal to see someone that short and compact carrying that much dense mass. The pose cemented Franco as one of the most intimidating and unforgettable champions and personalities as well. Now we have Frank Zayn, and honestly I could not pick just one pose because he had two that were equally iconic. The first is obviously the classic vacuum. Zayn was basically the guy who made the vacuum his trademark, sucking in the midsection so tight that it looked like he had no organs and that his ribcage was basically floating above his abs. It perfectly captured everything that people loved about him: clean lines, razor-sharp condition, and that very aesthetic look that defined himself as a bodybuilder, as well as the golden era as a whole. And then there's the second pose, which a lot of people now call the Ziz pose, or simply the classic one-arm overhead. Frank would stand pretty tall, one arm stretched out overhead, while the other trailed close by, twisting just enough to create that elegant, artistic silhouette. He would also add some touches like finger positioning and other twists and turns in the lower body, and overall it was such a powerful way to showcase his proportions and make bodybuilding feel almost like a sculpture. In my opinion, these two poses together summed up who Zayn was. He was not the biggest competitor, but he had this unmatched ability to present his physique in a way that felt timeless and very refined. Even decades later, you still see guys trying to recreate these shots, and nobody ever quite does it like Frank Zayn did. Next, we have Chris Dickerson with his archer pose. I'll be honest, out of all the Mr. Olympia champions, Chris is often seen as one of the more unremarkable or overlooked winners. But even so, this pose kind of stood out and gave him a unique signature on stage. The archer pose, where he would pull one arm back like he was almost drawing a bow, did a very good job of showing off his solid proportions and balanced physique. His quads looked very nice and defined, his waist stayed in control, and the overall stance had this commanding, very confident energy. It might not have been the flashiest or most dramatic pose, especially compared to some of the other legends or other competitors on this list, but in my opinion it suited him perfectly. Overall, what made this pose so impressive was that it summed up Chris's strengths without trying to really oversell anything. He was never the biggest or most aesthetic, but he always was very polished and precise. The archer pose kind of captured that quality. It felt classic, disciplined, and quietly powerful in a way that has earned more and more respect over time. Here we have Samir Banu in the famous Christmas tree pose. Samir was really the first guy to pioneer this shot, and it ended up becoming one of the most legendary back poses in all of bodybuilding. When he leaned forward and tightened up everything, those deep striations and etched lines across the insertions of the lower back created the silhouette of a Christmas tree, which is kind of how the pose got its name. To me, what makes this one so iconic is that Samir truly had one of the best backs ever seen on a Mr. Olympia. The detail, the separation, and really everything about that back were way ahead of its time, and it set a new standard for complete back development. Even today, when people talk about the best backs ever, Samir is always on that list. Personally, I think this pose is the ultimate example of how Samir combined aesthetics with freaky detail. He might not have had that same mass of other champions who came later, but his ability to display that level of refinement made this shot basically unforgettable. Now let's talk about Lee Haney and his incredible crucifix pose. This was one of those shots that perfectly summed up why Lee Haney was able to dominate bodybuilding for 8 straight Mr. Olympia titles. When he stretched his arms wide in that crucifix pose, it immediately showcased his amazing limb proportion and incredibly dense development. What made this pose so special was how it combined sheer size and shape with immaculate control. His waist stayed incredibly tight, often pulled into a vacuum, while the lats flared out massively, creating a ridiculous X-frame. On top of that, his tall stature gave this pose a even more imposing look, and the statuesque quality as well that came with a taller stature and a wider frame made him look almost untouchable compared to his competition. In my opinion, this crucifix pose is one of the main reasons Lee's physique still stands the test of time. It was the perfect blend between power and aesthetics, and it really emphasized how complete and polished he was when it came to being a Mr. Olympia champion. Even now, when people talk about classic posing, this image of Haney with his arms stretched out wide remains one of the most iconic visuals and images of all time, in my own opinion at least. Up next is Dorian Yates with his jaw-dropping Christmas tree pose. While Samir Banu was the one who pioneered this one first, Dorian absolutely dominated it and took it to an entire new level. When he leaned forward and locked everything in, you could see the most raw, detailed Christmas tree that really anyone has ever brought to any bodybuilding stage. What made this pose so impressive to me was the combination of sheer mass and freaky definition. His lower back was insanely thick, but it still had those deep carved lines that looked almost impossible on someone carrying that much mass. And it really didn't stop there. His glutes, the hamstrings, and the calves were all shredded and dense, which made the entire back view look complete and very overwhelming. In my opinion, this was the ultimate example of Dorian's approach to bodybuilding. Brutal size paired with no compromises anywhere when it came to condition. When he hit this pose, it basically sent a message to everyone that the era of grainy, granite-like muscle had officially arrived and was here to stay. It is still one of the craziest shots ever captured on film, and on a Mr. Olympia stage for that matter as well, and is a massive reason why Dorian's legacy has held up so powerfully over time. Next up, we have Ronnie Coleman and his absolutely legendary rear lat spread, what he famously called the lights out, game over rear lat spread.
Rear lat lights out spread.
Even though this was technically a mandatory pose, it became so synonymous with Ronnie Coleman that it felt like his personal signature. And honestly, when you saw it in person or even in pictures, the name was completely justified. This one was simply so great, not just for the fact that it was probably the best rear lat spread of all time, but also because of the way that Ronnie would present it. He had this routine where he would flare out his lats in stages, almost as if he was teasing the crowd before fully locking in, and then the second he did, it looked like a curtain of muscle just unfolded across his back. His traps, the shoulders, the lats, everything was just so thick and wide that it almost did not look real, and the detail throughout the lower back and glutes was also just as mind-blowing. In my opinion, the best part about all of this, though, was how the pose was paired with his trademark line, "Lights out, game over." That catchphrase kind of became part of this legendary competitor, and you could tell that he knew that nobody else would even be able to touch that level of dominance. Even today, countless pros try to imitate that moment, but nobody can quite recreate that combination of size and detail, as well as the charisma and likability that, Ronnie brought to the stage when he hit that pose. Moving on, we have Jay Cutler and what might be the single most iconic pose in all of bodybuilding history, the quad stomp. Even though Jay had been doing variations of this one earlier in his career, it was at the 2009 comeback where this pose truly became legendary. That year, after losing the Mr. Olympia title in 2008, he walked back on stage with a lot to prove, and this pose became the ultimate statement of revenge and dominance. What made it so special was the way he executed it. Jay would step forward, plant his foot down, and flex that quad so hard that all the deep cuts and striations popped out like a road map, and his face almost looked like he didn't even believe it was happening. The mass and the condition that he brought to that moment created an aura that felt almost unbeatable. It was as if he was saying to everyone watching, "I am back and you cannot deny this." In my opinion, no other pose has ever captured the feeling of reclaiming glory quite like the quad stomp did. It became an instant symbol of power and determination and is still replayed and imitated when it comes to those highlight reels and posing routines, even till this day. Even people who are not hardcore bodybuilding fans have surely seen this shot. It is simply that iconic. Next up, we have Dexter Jackson with his version of the classic Ziz pose, also known as the one-arm overhead pose. Dexter hit this one throughout his very long career, but it was especially iconic when it came to his prime years when his waist was tighter and his proportions were nearly perfect. When he struck that stance, one arm stretched up, the other nearby, it really highlighted the balance and clean flow that defined his physique. What I love the most about this pose is that it felt almost effortless for Dexter. He was never the biggest competitor, but it was not really about that. This shot reminded everyone why he was such a threat year after year. It showcased his trademark aesthetic, the round shoulders, sharp midsection, and that polished, very streamlined look that very few bodybuilders could match. Even as he got older and kept competing into his late 40s, this pose became, in my opinion, a symbol of his legacy and longevity. He could still hit it and look very solid, which goes to show you how well he maintained his shape over time. I'd give an honorable mention as well to his crab most muscular. It was always very impressive, but this one arm overhead pose captured everything people loved about Dexter when he was at his best. Now we have Phil Heath and his hands together most muscular. While a lot of people might point to Phil's back as having his defining poses, and they were incredible, don't get me wrong, this most muscular is, in my opinion, the one that truly captured what made him so special. Every time he hit it, you could see the insane 3D roundness that basically became his trademark. His delts looked like cannonballs, the biceps and triceps popped out in every single direction, and his quads simply flared out with deep cuts and immense fullness. It was the ultimate display of those cartoonish, almost unreal proportions that earned him the nickname The Gift. What I think is so great about this pose overall is that he hit it confidently throughout his entire career, from his early Mr. Olympia wins all the way to the later ones. No matter who stood next to him, this shot made it clear that he had a level of muscle separation and fullness that nobody else could match. Even today, when you see photos of Phil doing this pose, especially like in 2011 or 2013, it is very hard to not stare. It perfectly sums up why he was so dominant for so many years. Next up is Shawn Rhoden with his ab and thigh pose. Now, I know this is technically a mandatory pose, and I tried to keep this list focused on non-mandatory ones, but in Shawn's case, this one is iconic for a very unique reason. In 2018, the year he shocked the world and dethroned Phil Heath, this pose became the symbol of everything that set him apart. While Phil's midsection had started to blur and spill over, Shawn came in with a very refined aesthetic and absolutely picture-perfect set of abs. No matter which angle he hit it from, his waist stayed very tight, his lines were clean, and his presentation looked effortless. In my opinion, this was the pose that made the contrast impossible for the judges to ignore. When Shawn pulled into that ab and thigh, it was almost like a wake-up call, that this was the new standard that bodybuilding should follow. It not only helped him win the title, but also shifted the entire conversation in bodybuilding back towards the aesthetic shape. It is one of those moments that changed the course of bodybuilding when it comes to its history, and that's why it absolutely deserves to be considered an iconic pose. Moving on, we have Brandon Curry and his unique side ab and thigh pose. This has always been one of my personal favorite shots of Brandon because it perfectly played to his advantages while cleverly hiding his weaknesses. Instead of the traditional front-facing ab and thigh, he would turn to the side, showcasing his solid side leg development and keeping focus on his incredible midsection and sweeping aesthetic lines. To me, this pose stood out because of how smart and strategic it was. Brandon had always had a phenomenal upper body, wide shoulders, thick arms, a small waist, and that bubbly round 3D look, but his quads were never quite on the same level. By hitting the pose from the side, he minimized that flaw and emphasized the angle of the leg that looked the most complete, all the while keeping his waist tight and the abs very defined. In my opinion, the side ab and thigh became almost a signature move for him. It showed that he understood exactly how to present his physique in the most flattering way possible. Even in a lineup of mass monsters, this pose allowed Brandon to stand out with very clean aesthetics and a smart presentation, which is a big part of how he was able to win the Olympia title and stay competitive year after year. Next up is Big Ramy with his front lat spread. I will admit it was a little tough to pick a non-mandatory pose for Ramy because he was never really known as an artistic poser, but honestly his front lat spread was so insane that it deserves to be called iconic all on its own. When Ramy hit this pose, it looked like he was twice as wide as anyone standing next to him. His massive structure was completely filled out from top to bottom, those lats flaring out like wings, huge rounded off delts, and giant quads that swallowed up the entire front view. Even among the biggest competitors of all time, he made everyone else look small. In my opinion, what really took this pose to the next level was when he managed to come in fully conditioned. You could see some deep separation in his legs and solid detail in the chest and midsection, which made all the size look even more overwhelming. It might be a mandatory shot, but when Ramy did it, it felt like a signature move because nobody else could pull it off when it came to the combination of mass, presence, and width. It was one of those shots that perfectly captured his trademark size, as well as that insane silhouette, and undoubtedly helped him dominate during his career. Moving on, we have Hottie Chupin, who probably has the most iconic hands together, most muscular right now. This has always been one of Hottie's standout poses because it perfectly showcases the things that make his physique so impressive. When he locks it in, you could immediately see how crazy his condition is. Deep cuts across the abs, crisp, very sharp detail in the chest, and that dense, grainy look that really has become a trademark feature. What I like the most about this pose is how balanced it looks overall. Sure, Hottie does not really have the biggest arms or the roundest delts ever, but everything else looks really impressive and more than makes up for it. His quads are absolutely massive and separated, his midsection stays tight and is also almost flawless, and his chest looks very thick and striated from top to bottom. Together, it creates a look that is both powerful and very refined. In my opinion, this hands together most muscular really sums up why Hottie has been able to win the Olympia. It highlights all his strengths without really exposing any major weaknesses, and the level of detail he brings in this pose is something that very few competitors have today. It is a shot that has become almost symbolic of his no-nonsense, ultra-conditioned approach to bodybuilding. Next, we have Derek Lungsford with his front double biceps pose. Even though this is a mandatory pose, it is the one that really put Derek on the map and made people realize he had the potential to be an open Mr. Olympia. From his 2022 Pittsburgh Pro guest posing to his 2025 Pittsburgh Pro win, this pose has always been very impressive. Every time he hits it, whether he's really on or also kind of off, you can see why. It is the perfect showcase of his balance and shape. What makes this pose so special is the silhouette. Derek has an insanely small waist that he often pulls into a very tight vacuum, and when you combine that with wide flaring lats and arms that pop out just enough, it creates a very cartoonish X-frame that looks almost unreal. Even though his arms and quads are not necessarily the biggest or best of all time, the way they flare out makes his physique look even bigger than it truly is. In my opinion, this shot is the ultimate example of why Derek can beat guys that outweigh him by 20 or even 50 pounds. His structure, the proportions, and even just the overall shape are so good that the size alone is not enough to overshadow him. And he has grown into the open class a lot, and even also refined his condition, so this pose has only really gotten more and more dominant. It is always the opening mandatory pose, and every time he hits it, you can feel the energy in the crowd shift, like everyone knows he is the guy to beat. Finally, we have Samson Dauda with his variation of the crucifix. This one feels especially fitting because Samson has often been compared to a larger version of Lee Haney, and when he spreads his arms wide, you can really see why. This pose perfectly captures that blend of sheer size and beautiful structure and shape that makes him such a standout in today's era. What makes this crucifix so iconic is how effortlessly Samson fills the stage. His arms stretch on forever, his lats flare out nicely, and his waist stays very tight and creates that crazy V-taper. Even with all the mass that he carries, the pose still looks very clean and aesthetic, which is not really something you can say about many guys his size. Personally, I think this shot sums up what makes Samson so exciting as a modern Mr. Olympia champion. He has that old school flow and shape, but scaled up to a level of thickness and fullness that feels almost unreal. Every time he hits this crucifix, whether it's as an opener or, as a transition, it reminds people of the golden era but with an updated, freakier twist. It is a pose that really cements his identity as one of the most complete and impressive bodybuilders competing today, and possibly of all time. Anyways guys, that about does it for this video. Let me know in the comments down below your thoughts and opinions, and as always, I do hope you enjoyed this one. With that all being said though, I will see you all in the next one. Thanks for watching.